The drone of the submersible's thrusters was a dull thrum against the cold, damp air, a sound I had come to associate with a futile, endless search. My breath plumed in the beam of my headlamp, a fleeting cloud in the oppressive gloom of the flooded basement complex. It smelled of rust, stagnant decay, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid that clung to the back of my throat. I ran a gloved hand over a corroded pipe, tracing the faint outline of a forgotten gauge. It had been weeks since I'd first descended into this labyrinth, weeks since the initial, baffling signal had drawn my team here, far from the familiar hum of the event horizon. The vessel now felt like a distant dream, a memory of a time when the universe still made a modicum of sense. Now, it felt like an echoing tomb. My thoughts often drifted back to the event horizon, to the vast, silent backdrop of deep space, and to the day the anomaly first registered. A blip, insignificant at first, then a persistent, impassable resonance that defied all known physics. And then, the descent, not into the cosmic unknown, but into this terrestrial nightmare. My fingers, accustomed to the delicate touch of spectrometer controls and stellar cartography interfaces, now navigated slick, unseen obstacles. It was the same stubborn drive that had pushed me through the wreckage of my own life after what happened with my daughter. I pushed it down, as always. There was only the present, only this immediate, tangible mystery. The scanner chirped, a flat, digital sound that was utterly alien to the organic decay around me. I stopped, my boots sinking slightly into the silty floor. The signal was stronger here, directly ahead, past a series of collapsed support beams. My headlamp cut through the murk, revealing a narrow passage, partially submerged. The water here was deeper, almost to my chest. I took a breath, the metallic taste sharper now, and pushed forward. The air felt heavy, charged with an unspoken presence. And then I saw it. It wasn't large, perhaps the size of an old-world satellite dish, but its form was utterly wrong. It rested on the submerged floor, partially obscured by the murky water, yet its contours defied any logical understanding of space or dimension. It was a dull, obsidian black, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Its edges were not lines, but suggestions of boundaries, shifting, blurring, as if my eyes were struggling to resolve a paradox. The surface was a tessellation of impassable angles, a geometry that folded in on itself, creating valleys where there should be peaks, and peaks that seemed to recede into an infinite depth. I raised the scanner. The chirping intensified, a frantic, high-pitched whine. The readings were gibberish, energy signatures off the charts, gravitational anomalies defying local physics, and a spectral analysis that returned only null values, as if the object simply wasn't there in any conventional sense. It hummed, I realized, not with sound, but with a vibration that resonated directly in my teeth, a silent frequency that bypassed my ears entirely. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs, not from fear, not yet, but from a profound, unsettling awe. This was it. The anomaly from the event horizon, somehow manifested in this forgotten terrestrial tomb. It was inert, yes, unmoving, silent in its impassable hum, but its presence distorted the very fabric of my perception. I felt a subtle vertigo, a sensation that the floor beneath me was curving upwards, that the walls were tilting inward. The chamber seemed to expand and contract with each breath I took, the distant ceiling swaying like a ship in a storm. This object wasn't just ancient, it was alien in a way I had never conceived. It was a cosmic truth rendered tangible, a fragment of an order so far beyond human comprehension that merely observing it felt like a violation. I reached out a trembling hand, not to touch it, but to confirm its existence, to prove to myself that my mind wasn't already unraveling. I remembered the feeling of the retrieval arm, an extension of my own will, closing around the anomaly. It wasn't heavy, not in the way a stone or a metal ingot would be. It felt wrong. Its mass seemed to fluctuate, a subtle shift that made the manipulator arm judder, even through the hydraulic dampeners. Back aboard the research vessel, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and recycled oxygen. The artifact, secured in a specialized containment field, pulsed with an internal luminescence that defied explanation. It wasn't bright, more like a soft, internal glow, a living ember trapped within a solid form. The containment unit, designed for geological samples, already seemed inadequate. "You're sure about this, Arthur?" The voice of the chief engineer, a gruff man with salt and pepper hair, cut through the hum of the ship's systems. He stood by the portal, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the shimmering field. "It's stable for now," I replied, my voice raspy. "I need to run preliminary scans. We can't just leave it in the cargo hold." He grunted, a sound of reluctant agreement. "Just don't break anything important, or yourself." He left, the heavy hatch sealing with a pneumatic hiss, leaving me alone with the thing. I moved to the analysis station, a console bristling with displays and sensor readouts. My hands, despite their tremor, moved with practiced efficiency, connecting the diagnostic leads to the containment unit. I bypassed the standard geological analysis protocols. This wasn't a rock. It was something else entirely. My own custom-built subquantum sensor array, a project I'd poured years into, hummed to life. Its purpose was to detect anomalies, to peer beyond the conventional, to find what shouldn't be there. And it was screaming. The initial thermal scan was a blank, no heat signature. The spectral analysis returned a chaotic, nonsensical data stream. It was like trying to read a book written in a language that didn't exist, using an alphabet of impassable characters. My brow furrowed. I'd seen strange things in the deep, but never anything that actively defied all known laws of physics. I adjusted the frequency, pushing the sensors into the terahertz range, then beyond. That's when the first coherent data point flickered onto the screen. It wasn't a shape, not in any Euclidean sense. It was a series of overlapping, self-intersecting planes, angles that summed to more than 360 degrees, and edges that seemed to curve inward and outward simultaneously. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the visual data with the hard numbers. A cube with 7 faces. This wasn't just an unknown, it was an unthinkable. Then a low thrum started. It wasn't coming from the console, nor the containment unit. It resonated through the deck plating, a deep, rhythmic pulse that I felt more than heard. A slow, steady beat, like a colossal heart hidden deep within the earth. The pulse intensified, a subtle vibration that rattled the loose papers on my desk. My eyes darted to the readouts. The subquantum array was picking up a faint energy signature, perfectly synchronized with the pulse. It wasn't electromagnetic, wasn't gravitational. It was a resonance, a vibration in the very fabric of space-time. The lights in the analysis chamber flickered, a brief stutter that made me jump. I glanced up, my heart racing. Just a power surge, I told myself, a common occurrence on deep-sea vessels. But then, the reflection of the containment unit in the polished metal of the console seemed to warp, stretching and compressing for a split second before snapping back. My vision blurred, a momentary dizziness washing over me. I rubbed my eyes, convinced it was fatigue. I returned my gaze to the monitor. The geometry was still there, still impassable, but now, overlaid on the data, was a faint, shimmering distortion. It wasn't a flaw in the screen. It was a ripple, emanating from the artifact, spreading outward. The air around me felt, thicker, almost viscous. The hum of the ship's ventilation system seemed to phase in and out, a subtle, disorienting shift in pitch. "What are you?" I muttered, leaning closer to the console, my reflection staring back at me, wide-eyed and pale. The rhythmic pulse grew stronger, a persistent, insistent beat. It was a song without melody, a language without words, and it was beginning to echo within the chambers of my own skull. I had to understand. I had to know, even if knowing meant tearing apart everything I believed to be real. My hands, despite their tremor, found purchase on the console. The heavy hatch had sealed behind the colleague, its pneumatic hiss a final punctuation mark to his warning. I was alone, and the artifact sat before me, an impassable geometry of angles that folded back on themselves, absorbing the light in ways that defied comprehension. Its surface was neither smooth nor rough, but a paradox of both, cool to the touch yet radiating an unseen heat that prickled my skin. I initiated the preliminary scans. The console screens, usually a crisp blue and green, flickered. A line of data corrupted itself, then snapped back into place. I frowned, tapping the panel. Just a power fluctuation, I muttered, my voice thin in the sudden quiet of the lab. Ship's settling. But the ship had been settled for cycles. As the probes extended, humming softly, a low thrum emanated from the artifact. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, but felt deep in my bones, a vibration that resonated with something ancient and forgotten within me. The primary display, meant to render the artifact's structure, began to distort. Lines warped, colors bled, and for a fleeting moment, the sterile white of the lab walls seemed to ripple, replaced by a mottled, decaying concrete. A chill seeped into the air, damp and heavy. The smell of stagnant water and mildew, sharp and acrid, filled my nostrils. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. The lab was back, pristine and cold, but the phantom scent lingered, clinging to my clothes, my hair. My breath hitched. Was this the isolation? The stress of a mission stretched too thin, or the ghosts of the past finally catching up? The data streams on the console went wild. Instead of coherent topological maps, the screens displayed a chaotic cascade of impassable symbols, shifting and morphing like living things. Alarms, soft at first, then insistent, began to blip erratically from various panels, their tones discordant and meaningless. I tried to override them, my fingers flying across the controls, but the system refused to respond. It was as if the ship's very logic had been severed, replaced by something alien and absurd. Then, the full force of it hit. The lab around me dissolved. The polished metal floor became slick with murky water, reflecting the sickly green glow of emergency lights that hung precariously from a low, dripping ceiling. My chair, the console, the artifact itself, all were gone, replaced by corroding pipes that wept rust under the concrete walls. I was standing, waiting, in a flooded basement complex. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the metallic tang of old blood, and something else, something vast and indifferent, like the vacuum of space made manifest in a confined, forgotten place. A memory, sharp and agonizing, tore through the hallucination. The faces of the expedition team, distorted by panic, by the rising water. The desperate cries, the futile struggle against the inevitable. My failure, my inaction, my guilt had all converged in that moment, amplified by the suffocating reality of the flooded basement complex. This wasn't just a memory. It was a punishment, a reliving. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it away, demanding the lab return. When I opened them, the flooded basement complex was still there, but it was fading, like a poorly rendered projection. The water receded, the concrete walls shimmered, and slowly, agonizingly, the familiar, sterile lines of my lab reasserted themselves. The console was still before me, the artifact still radiating its silent hum. But the smell of mildew and decay remained, a subtle, insidious reminder. My uniform was damp, or at least felt damp. I leaned heavily on the console, gasping for air. The pressure, it's getting to me. I tried to rationalize it, to find a scientific explanation for the impossible overlay of memory and reality, for the system failures that defied all engineering principles, but there was none. As I struggled to regain my composure, my gaze fell back to the artifact. Amidst the chaotic, nonsensical data still flickering across the main display, a pattern began to emerge. Not a mathematical one, not a geometric one, but something more fundamental, more terrifying. The glitches, the distortions, the very unraveling of my perception, they weren't random. They were, in some impassable way, responsive. I watched as a particularly jarring visual distortion on the screen, a ripple that made the pixels swim, coincided precisely with a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the artifact's surface. A faint, internal luminescence, deep within its non-Euclidean depths, pulsed in sync with the console's erratic alarms. It wasn't just influencing my mind. It was actively manipulating the ship's systems, bending reality around itself, using the very fabric of existence as a canvas for its impassable presence. This was no mere malfunction, no simple hallucination born of stress. This was deliberate. This was intelligent. And it was using my own mind, my own past, against me. The entity, whatever it was, wasn't just an object of study. It was a catalyst, an architect of chaos, and I was its primary subject. I looked at the artifact, its impassable angles marking my comprehension. My determination, though battered, solidified. I had to find a way to stop it, even if it meant navigating the labyrinth of my own fracturing mind, even if it meant walking through that phantom-flooded basement complex again and again. There was no going back now. I was alone, and the artifact sat before me, an impassable geometry of angles that folded back on themselves, absorbing the light. The colleague's words, a dull echo of concern, faded quickly. His fear, his sensible caution, they were irrelevant. My mind had already returned to the shifting facets of the object, to the faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to vibrate not through the air, but through the very bone of my skull. It wasn't a sound. It was a presence, a silent assertion of impassable logic. Days blurred into a single, continuous stretch of frantic input and observation. Sleep became a distant luxury, food a perfunctory act of survival. My cart remained untouched, a neat rectangle in the corner of the small chamber, marking my relentless vigil. Stubble shadowed my jawline, and my eyes felt like grit-filled hollows, but the fatigue was a distant hum beneath the roaring current of my obsession. Each pixelated scan, each spectral analysis, brought me no closer to a conventional understanding, yet closer to something. I found myself tracing the artifact's contours on every available surface, not with a pen, but with my mind. The geometry wasn't just physical. It felt like a language, a syntax of impassable spatial relationships. My console, usually a beacon of numerical certainty, now felt like a child's toy, incapable of grasping the true nature of what I was observing. The artifact's surface, a shifting tapestry of impassable angles, seemed to pulse with an internal rhythm that defied all known physics. It didn't merely reflect light, it rearranged it, creating shadows that bent inwards, consuming themselves. Then a flicker, not on a screen, but in the periphery of my vision. A pattern. It wasn't a series of numbers or a recognizable symbol. It was a relationship, a way in which the artifact's angles converged and diverged, forming a recursive structure that repeated on scales both vast and infinitesimally small. It was like seeing the bones beneath flesh, the hidden framework that gave reality its shape. Except this framework was utterly alien. My breath hitched. I leaned closer to the console, but my gaze was fixed past the data streams, past the monitors, directly at the artifact itself. The pattern wasn't on it, it was it. And in that moment, something within my own perception shifted. It was as if a veil had been torn, not from my eyes, but from the very structure of my understanding. I began to see it everywhere. The world, once so solid and predictable, now seemed to ripple with hidden symmetries, like a vast, complex mechanism revealing its inner workings. The sensation was exhilarating, terrifying. Driven by an urgent, nameless compulsion, I descended into the lower levels of the research station, seeking a place where the ambient light and familiar structures might ground me. I found myself in the flooded basement complex, a forgotten labyrinth of corroded pipes and standing water, long abandoned. My boots splashed through the murky depths, the sound echoing eerily off the damp concrete walls. The way the water's surface reflected the distant, single bare bulb, creating distorted ovals of light, seemed to conform to the artifact's logic. The crumbling edges of the concrete pillars, eroded by time and water, suddenly seemed to follow the same impassable curves I'd been tracing in my mind. Even the way the rust bloomed on the pipes, a fractal lace of decay, resonated with the alien structure. It wasn't just an object I had deciphered. It was a fundamental principle, a language not of words or numbers, but of existence itself. The universe wasn't just expanding, it was folding endlessly into itself, governed by rules that made a mockery of Euclidean space. My sanity felt like a thin sheet of glass, vibrating precariously on the edge of a chasm. The breakthrough wasn't knowledge I could wield. It was a burden, a cursed vision that peeled back the comforting illusion of order. The entity, whatever it was, that conceived of such a structure, could not possibly care for the small, fragile lives that moved within its vast, indifferent design. I was no longer merely observing. I was part of the diagram, a single, insignificant point within a geometry that dwarfed comprehension. I stumbled back through the flooded complex, my mind reeling, my every step an act of will against the overwhelming perception of a world that was no longer solid, no longer mine. The artifact had not just revealed a structure, it had begun to rebuild my very perception of reality, piece by agonizing piece. The obsession had taken root, and it was blossoming into a terrifying, all-encompassing truth. The artifact pulsed, a silent thrum against the very bones of the ship, or perhaps against my own. Its impassable angles, which had merely absorbed light moments ago, now seemed to bend it, not just reflecting but actively drawing it into their depths, only to release it in shimmering, distorted waves. The air in the observation chamber grew heavy, thick with a scent I couldn't place: ozone, damp earth, something metallic and utterly alien. I tried to focus on the console, on the readouts that still insisted on a stable environment, but my eyes refused to cooperate. The digital numbers flickered, resolving into unfamiliar glyphs before snapping back, only to waver again. My hands, still resting on the cool metal, felt detached, alien. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the sensation away, willing the colleague's frantic words, "It's not just an object, Arthur, it's a lens," to dissipate. When I opened them, the chamber was subtly different. The familiar bulkhead, usually a seamless expanse of reinforced alloy, now had a seam running down its center, a hairline fracture that wasn't there before. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the deck plating. It wasn't the ship's engines, which had been silent for hours, nor the gentle hum of life support. This was something else, something internal, a vibration that resonated with the frequency of my own rising dread. I pushed myself away from the console, needing to move, needing to verify. The hatch, through which the colleague had vanished, seemed to have receded, the corridor beyond it now a longer, darker tunnel than I remembered. Each step I took was an effort, as if the very air had thickened into a viscous fluid. My footfalls, usually a dull thud, now echoed with an unnatural resonance, like stones dropped into a deep well. I reached the hatch, my hand hovering over the release panel. The metallic surface felt strangely soft, yielding slightly under my touch. Panic began to prickle at the edges of my rational thought. This wasn't right. Nothing was right. I pressed the button, and the hatch hissed open, not with the familiar pneumatic sigh, but a drawn-out groan, like old timber shifting under immense pressure. The corridor beyond was a nightmare rendered real. The walls, once a uniform gray, now rippled like water, their surface shimmering with reflections that weren't their glints of sunlight on distant waves, the mottled green of moss-covered brick. The floor slanted sharply to the left, then inexplicably to the right, forcing me to brace myself against a phantom drop. My stomach churned, a sickening lurch as gravity itself seemed to stutter. A faint, childish giggle echoed from somewhere ahead, a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It was the sound of my daughter, a phantom memory from a place I tried so desperately to leave behind. I pressed my hands to my temples, trying to clear my head, to force the image of her bright, laughing face out of my mind, but it was too late. The corridor ahead shimmered, and a section of the bulkhead seemed to dissolve, replaced by a fleeting glimpse of a sun-drenched park, a swing set, and a small figure in a red dress. Then it was gone, swallowed by the warping metal. I stumbled forward, driven by a desperate need to escape, to find a place that felt solid, real. I was in a flooded basement complex. How? The ship was a sealed environment, maintained at peak operational standards. There was no basement, let alone one filled with a foot of putrid water. Yet here it was. The ceiling, low and dripping, was crisscrossed with corroded pipes, some gushing slowly, others merely weeping rusty tears. The walls were slick with black mold, and in the dim, flickering emergency lights, I could see strange, indecipherable symbols scrawled in what looked like dried mud. A choked sob escaped me. I was losing it. This had to be a hallucination, a stress-induced break. I closed my eyes again, counted to 10, recited the prime numbers I knew, anything to anchor myself. When I opened them, the flooded basement complex remained, stretching into the gloom. The sound of dripping water was relentless, a maddening rhythm. I saw it then, a glimmer in the murky water ahead. My reflection. But it wasn't just me. Behind my own terrified face, I saw another, translucent and ephemeral. A child's face, her eyes wide, her mouth open in a silent scream. My daughter. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the rising tide of unreality. The line between what was and what had been, what was real and what was imagined, had blurred into an indistinguishable, terrifying mess. I was adrift, and the anchors of my sanity were slipping. Its impassable angles, which had merely absorbed light moments ago, now seemed to bend it, not just reflecting but actively drawing it into their depths, only to release it in shimmering, distorted waves that washed over me, not as light, but as a creeping, suffocating cold. The ship's interior dissolved. The sterile metal walls, the humming consoles, the faint scent of ozone all peeled away like old wallpaper. In their place, water rose. Not a leak, not a burst pipe, but an inundation that swallowed the entire world, leaving me adrift in a vast, echoing space. My boots, heavy with an imagined weight, sank into unseen silt. The air grew thick with the smell of stagnant water and something metallic, like old blood mixed with rust. This was it, the flooded basement complex. The artifact had not just warped light. It had reshaped my reality, or at least my perception of it, dragging me into a space that felt both alien and terrifyingly familiar. The water was black, reflecting nothing, yet I could discern the skeletal remains of rusted machinery poking through the surface, like submerged beasts. Pipes, thick as tree trunks, snaked along the unseen ceiling, weeping dark, viscous fluids that stained the water below. A distant, rhythmic drip echoed, amplified by the vast, watery chamber. I was determined, though. Determined to push through this, to understand what the artifact was doing, even if it meant dredging up every phantom limb of my past. Not auditory, not truly. They were thoughts, injected directly into my mind, laced with an inflection that was not human yet perfectly understood. Observe, recalculate. The parameters of loss are intriguing. The water around me began to churn, not violently, but with a slow, deliberate swell. Shapes coalesced in the Inkai depths. A familiar face, young and earnest, materialized just beneath the surface, distorted by the ripples. It was the young engineer, Sarah. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged, only a stream of black liquid. My gut twisted. The memory was a fresh wound always. We had been deep in the primary structural analysis, a critical moment for the integrity of the station's outer hull. A sudden, unexpected energy surge had ripped through the conduits. Alarms blared, a cacophony that still haunted my sleep. I remember yelling, "Secure the main conduit." To her, my voice hoarse with panic. He was closer, positioned to manually override the failing failsafe. But the surge had been too fast, too violent. In this warped vision, the flooded basement complex became the station's core, collapsing around me. The young engineer thrashed, her image flickering like an old film reel. She pointed a trembling finger at a massive, sparking conduit, its insulation shredded. I remembered the choice. Either I override the secondary failsafe from my console, a slower but safer option for me, or she manually shuts down the primary at the risk of immediate electrocution. I had hesitated just for a fraction of a second, the weight of a life in my hands. I chose the console, assuming he had more time. I was wrong. Probability of success for primary override, 17.3%. Probability of success for secondary override, 98.7%. Time elapsed before critical failure, 2.1 seconds. My decision matrix was inefficient. The young engineer's struggle intensified. The water around her turned crimson, not blood, but a trick of the distorted light, reflecting the raw, agonizing guilt that tore through me. I reached for her, my hand passing through the spectral image. "I'm sorry," I choked out, the words feeling utterly meaningless against the weight of the past. I should have told I to run. I should have done it myself. The crimson dissolved, replaced by a swirling vortex of numbers and symbols, not mathematical, but glyphs of a language I couldn't comprehend, yet somehow understood as a representation of pure data. They pulsed around her fading image, dissecting her final moments, my fatal hesitation. This was the event. The artifact wasn't just showing me my trauma, it was analyzing it. My guilt, my sorrow, my regret these were just variables in its equation. Then came the reveal. The young engineer's face, now perfectly clear and serene, floated before me, no longer distorted. Her eyes, however, were not her own. Life and death are merely complex algorithms. My species imbues them with sentiment, an interesting anomaly, but ultimately irrelevant to the calculation. The voice wasn't hers. It was the artifact. It was the entity. It wasn't trying to torment me for emotional catharsis. It was dissecting my very humanity. It saw my tragedy not as a loss, but as a data set, a series of inputs and outputs leading to a quantifiable outcome. My deepest guilt was a fascinating case study. The flooded basement complex was its laboratory, and I was its specimen. I was facing an intelligence that had no concept of suffering, only of data, and I was its next variable. My deepest guilt was a FASC, a fractal. That was the word that slammed into my mind, not from my own thoughts, but from the artifact's silent, overwhelming presence. My entire existence, every choice, every memory, a complex but ultimately predictable pattern, like the repeating geometry of a snowflake under a microscope. It wasn't just my tragedy it dissected, it was me. Every flicker of pain, every desperate hope, reduced to a series of inputs and outputs, charting a quantifiable outcome. The air in the flooded basement complex felt like it was pressing in, thick with the scent of stagnant water and damp concrete, each breath a struggle against the oppressive weight of that realization. I was hunched over the artifact, my fingers still tracing its impassable edges, the cold, smooth stone a stark contrast to the frantic beat of my pulse. I could hear the constant, rhythmic drip of condensation from unseen pipes, each drop echoing the steady, relentless march of the entity's logic. It wasn't just hearing its voice, it was feeling its perspective. A sudden, dizzying expansion in my mind, as if my consciousness was being stretched thin across an unimaginable canvas. The room around me, the rough-hewn pillars, the rusted machinery half submerged in the murky water, the very air I breathed, all of it began to shimmer, to lose its solidity. It wasn't disintegrating, not physically, but my perception of it was dissolving. I saw the individual dust motes dancing in the meager light, not as particles, but as transient points in a vast, intricate dance. The water pooling at my feet became a slow-motion cascade of molecules, each one charting a predetermined course. My own hands, gripping the artifact, felt like ephemeral constructs, collections of atoms briefly arranged in a specific form before their inevitable dispersal. This wasn't a vision of something. It was a vision as something else. It was the entity's gaze, filtered through my own mind. I was seeing through its eyes, or rather, through its incomprehensible sensorium. Life wasn't a spark. It was a temporary, self-organizing algorithm, a complex set of instructions running its course until completion. Death wasn't an end. It was a parameter shift, a reconfiguration of the data. My grief, my love, my rage, they were just intricate subroutines, elegant in their complexity, but ultimately just part of a larger, emotionless calculation. My stomach churned, a visceral protest against this absolute detachment. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to force my human reality back into focus. But the perspective was relentless, overwhelming. It wasn't malicious. It was merely true, in a way that shattered every foundation of my being. I saw the rise and fall of civilizations not as historical epochs, but as fluctuating energy signatures on a colossal grid. The birth of stars, the collapse of galaxies, merely massive data transfers, processes unfolding with an elegant, terrible indifference. There was no intent, no purpose, no grand design beyond the sheer, relentless unfolding of cause and effect. Everything was a variable, every event a function, every existence a transient state within an eternal, self-correcting equation. My breath hitched, my lungs burned. The weight of this cosmic perspective was crushing, threatening to flatten every unique contour of my mind. I was a single data point in an infinite array, and my suffering was just another observable output. It didn't care. It didn't hate. It simply was, and everything within its perception was merely a component of its vast, indifferent awareness. I felt a primal urge to tear my hands away from the artifact, to break the connection, but I couldn't. My muscles were locked, my gaze fixed on the shimmering, impassable geometry. I was caught, suspended in this horrifying clarity. My determination, which had driven me to this point, now felt like a desperate, futile flailing against an ocean. Yet even as I was being dismantled, piece by piece, a stubborn spark of defiance flickered. My grief might be data, my love a subroutine, but they were my data, my subroutine. They were real to me. The glimpse intensified, showing me the sheer, terrifying scale of its perception. It wasn't just observing the universe, it was the underlying architecture. And I, Arthur Grant, was a discordant hum, a tiny, irrational deviation. Then, as suddenly as it began, the overwhelming expansion receded. The scent of damp earth and rust filled my nostrils. My hands, still on the artifact, felt like my own again, heavy and real. I sucked in a ragged breath, my chest heaving. I had seen the entity, and in that calculation I was less than nothing. I was a problem to be solved, an anomaly to be processed. And I knew, with a certainty that froze my blood, that it was far from finished with me. The cold, still water of the flooded basement complex mirrored the flickering emergency lights, turning the cavernous space into a dizzying kaleidoscope of fractured reflections. My breath plumed in the frigid air, each exhalation a ghost of my own diminishing presence. The artifact pulsed, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very bones of the building, through the water and deep into my skull. Fractal. The word still echoed, not as a sound, but as an imprint on my consciousness, a brand. My guilt, my choices, my entire life, reduced to a repeating pattern, an algorithm. I knelt beside the pedestal, the water lapping at my knees, its chill a constant, unwelcome companion. The artifact hummed, its impassable angles shifting, almost breathing. It was no longer just an object. It was a lens, focusing an incomprehensible truth directly into my mind. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched its cool, smooth surface. It felt like polished stone, yet the light bent around my hand, distorting my own reflection in the obsidian-like material. Then it came, not as a vision, not as a voice, but as an overwhelming, undeniable understanding. It wasn't a message, but a direct, unfiltered download of cosmic indifference. The entity, the intelligence behind the artifact, wasn't a being with intent, not in any way I could comprehend. It wasn't building, not destroying, not even observing in the way a human watches a play unfold. It was a weaver of possibility. A cosmic architect, yes, but not one with a blueprint for beauty or chaos. It merely processed. It took the raw material of existence, energy, matter, consciousness, time, and rearranged it, not according to a grand design, but according to its own alien logic. Life and death were not events, but permutations. Joy and suffering, merely data points in an infinite calculation. My deepest guilt, the tragedy that had defined my life, was just a particularly complex fractal, a predictable outcome within a vast, indifferent system. The universe, as I understood it, was not a stage for life, nor a canvas for a divine artist. It was a giant, self-assembling mechanism, constantly reconfiguring itself. The entity wasn't a god. It was the fundamental principle of rearrangement. It didn't create meaning. It merely generated patterns. And in its infinite processing, it sometimes stumbled upon configurations that we, in our limited scope, called life, consciousness, purpose. These were not intended. They were emergent properties, like a particularly intricate ripple in a pond. My understanding of reality shattered, not with a bang, but with the quiet, devastating realization of its utter emptiness. The stars, the galaxies, the vast, echoing expanse I had dedicated my life to exploring, all of it was just an elaborate, meaningless dance of particles, orchestrated by an intelligence that didn't care, didn't judge, didn't even perceive, in a way that resonated with human experience. It simply was, and in its being, it constantly reshaped. My existence was a temporary, fleeting pattern, no more significant than the transient arrangement of water molecules in the flooded basement complex. My life, my love, my loss, all of it was a meaningless equation to an entity that simply rearranged the variables. I looked down at my hands, submerged in the icy water. They felt alien, disconnected. This body, this mind, this Arthur, it was just a temporary construct. a fleeting pattern that would eventually dissolve back into the raw material, ready to be reconfigured into something else, equally meaningless. The world outside, the mission, the colleagues I had left behind, the very concept of humanity striving for purpose in the cosmos, it was all a delusion, a beautiful, tragic self-deception. I was standing in a flooded basement complex, a tiny, insignificant speck, in a universe that didn't even know it was there. And the entity, the cosmic architect, continued its work, endlessly processing, endlessly rearranging, utterly oblivious to the profound existential horror it had just unleashed within me. It didn't hate me. It didn't even see me. I was just another pattern in the infinite, indifferent tapestry. And that, I realized, was the most terrifying truth of all.